Okay, let's talk a little bit about the features of a bond, the overview of what different things could be part of a bond. These are not calculations, these are just things that would impact the value of a bond in the marketplace. So let's think about this versus equity. The first thing is debt is, of course, not ownership. Equity is ownership. If you buy stock, you are an owner, and debt is simply a loan. Creditors do not have voting rights. Equity owners do have voting rights. Common shares do get voted. Interest is considered a cost of doing business as tax deductible. So a company paying interest will pay interest to a bond holder, and they can write that off. And of course, if it's a taxable bond, you have to pay taxes on it. So if you are receiving interest payments, those are going to be taxable. We'll talk more about taxes in a minute. Creditors have legal recourse if interest payments and principals are missed. So, as we know, the stockholders will be the first ones that are removed from the equation, and whatever assets are left over will be divvied up to the bondholders or to the debt holders. Some debt might be preferred over other debt, and they would get first dibs on whatever's left over when the company goes bankrupt. Remember, a company cannot go bankrupt if it doesn't have any debt. Bankruptcy is a way of legally getting your money back if the company goes bankrupt. So it's getting money for the debts the company has incurred when it can no longer afford to pay you the proper amount of payment. And excess debt can lead to financial distress and bankruptcy. We've talked before about financial debt, or any kind of debt is leverage, and it magnifies the result of your gains or losses. So we like a lot of debt if we have appreciating assets. We want no debt in depreciating assets, and of course we don't want depreciating assets at all. So there's a big difference between debt holders and equity holders. Equity holders are owners. Debt holders have simply made loans to the company or to the firm. Bond features, there's a bunch here, there's a bunch in your textbook. There's going to be the amount of issue. They issued $1 billion here, $1 billion, $1,000 at a time. The date of issue, the maturity, the face value. In this case, it's $2,000, but in our case, we're always talking about $1,000. Annual coupon, the offer price, securities. There's sinking funds, call provisions, call price, and a bond rating. We're going to talk about those last few of them over the next few minutes to give you some different ideas of what goes into the contract of a bond or a bond indenture. So a bond indenture is a contract. It's the name of the contract between the company and the bondholders. It gives you the basic terms, as we've seen, the total amount of bonds issued, the description of property, if there's property involved, as security or collateral. And it has sinking funds, call provisions, and details of protective covenants. So these sound like technical terms, so let's talk a little bit more about those. Sinking fund means that the repaying of funds were borrowed, by the company. They're going to repay them in periodic payments to a trustee who retires part of the issue. In other words, a sinking fund means that if I issued $100,000 worth of bonds for 10 years, every year I would buy back $10,000 worth of bonds. So at the end, I didn't have any debt left except for the last year. So a sinking fund is they buy back some of their bonds every year. That way, at the end, they don't owe so much money. Now, a lot of companies like to just keep rolling over their bonds because they're using the bonds as collateral for their operation. So they built a big factory, and the bonds are funding the factory, so they just keep rolling them over at current interest rates. So this is why when high interest rates happen, companies don't want to issue bonds. They want to have low costs of capital. The call provisions, a bond can be redeemed by the issuer prior to its maturity. So there's two ways to look at this. Is if you are the bond holder and you think interest rates are going to go up, do you want your bond called? Well, yes, of course you do. You want your money back so you can buy a new bond. But they're never going to call a bond when interest rates are rising. But when interest rates are falling and you're the bond holder, interest rates are falling, the company could come back in and you've got this nice high interest rates paying you 7-8% interest, and interest rates fall to 4%. The company can come back in if there is a call provision of the bond and take hand you your $1,000 back and take the bond back. And that's a call provision. So they would have to pay a little bit extra for this call provision, but a lot of companies do it if they feel interest rates would be going lower, because then they can reissue the bonds at a lower interest rate and save themselves paying the interest. There's a deferred call. So a deferred call would be that it's set for a number of years, and then after that they could have a call premium. So you're guaranteed interest for a certain number of years before they could call the bond and reissue it at a lower rate. Other aspects, there are protective covenants. So protective covenants can be positive or negative, depending on if you're the bondholder or the company that's issuing the bond. Basically, they are stipulations in the contract. For example, a common one would be that you have to have a certain ratio of debt to equity. So you can't just keep issuing bonds to everyone, because now all of a sudden my bonds become more risky because you could go bankrupt, and now I'm splitting the collateral within more and more people. So that would be one. If you had collateral, clearly a covenant is going to be that you can't sell the collateral or you have to pay back the bond. You also may have to have certain amounts of cash in the bank to make sure your debt to equity or your current ratio needs to be at a certain level. Otherwise, the bondholder feels that they wouldn't get their money back. They can put all kinds of little protective covenants in there, and each bond's going to be slightly different in that respect. So when we look at, there's one other thing, debentures. Debentures are a debt instrument that is not secured by physical assets or collateral. So a debenture is basically a high interest loan that is not secured by anything, and if you don't get paid back, you don't get paid back. And that's a very risky way to do it, but of course the interest rate would be commensurate with that risk. So debentures will pay a higher rate of interest than others. Required yields. If we look at this in conjunction, having thought about what the little nuances of the bonds would be, let's talk about required yields. So secured debt versus a debenture. Well, which one would have a higher yield? Secured debt or a debenture? Well, secured debt is safer than a debenture, and the one that is the least safe will have the highest yield. So the highest yield would be the debenture. So risk is related to reward. So the highest risk will get the higher interest rate. Subordinated debt versus senior debt. Well, senior debt is going to get paid back first. Subordinated debt is going to get paid back last. Therefore, the subordinated debt is more risky, and it would have a higher yield. A bond with a sinking fund versus one without a sinking fund. Well, a bond with a sinking fund is going to recall the bonds over time and make them more and more stable, so the company would be more stable, so that would be less risky than a non-sinking fund, which would have a lot of debt out there at the right at the beginning and then hold all that debt till the end. So it would be less risky to have a sinking fund bond than a non-sinking fund bond, unless, of course, you thought interest rates were going to go in your favor and you didn't want your bond recalled. Calling a bond, a callable bond versus a non-callable bond. A non-callable bond sounds risky, more risky than not. However, if you think about it, a callable bond gives the company the option to call the bond and give you your money back. Well, if the company can issue, you give you your money back, the only time they're going to do it is when the bond has risen in price. So a callable bond that has risen in price and interest rates have fallen, is probably likely they will call the bond, and if they do, you're not going to be able to keep those nice high coupon payments that you were expecting, nor can you sell it at the higher price. Therefore, a call feature will add to the cost of the bond for the issuer and be more risky for the person who's lending the money. So call bonds are higher interest rates than non-callable bonds. So now we've talked about a little bit about the required yields. It's not so important that you memorize all of that. Just remember, risk is related to reward. The reason the interest rates would go up is because you're taking more risk with the money. You won't get it back first in the terms of secured versus or subordinated versus senior, or you have not as much collateral, which is secured versus debentures or unsecured. Or that callable bond, you might get it back when you don't want to get it back, which is when interest rates have fallen and you have to go reinvest your money into a lower priced bond. So just remember, risk versus reward. These are all examples of that, and you'll be able to think through questions like this. Let's keep going into inflation.